Bloodsworth was a Cambridge waterman, grew up in Cambridge, Maryland. Went to graduated from a non-accredited Bible high school, but immediately entered the Marine Corps. And he's white, he's big and strong. He was a discus thrower, and actually was like all Marine discus thrower in the Marine Corps. Got out, he was 21 or 22, drifted up to Baltimore, was hanging with sort of a rough crowd, ran into a woman who was 10 years older than he was. Like group house, a lot of drugs, and not very many people employed. They were married maybe 6 months, but things didn't go well, and they had a fight, and he quit his job and hitchhiked back to Cambridge, and was sort of strung out and depressed and feeling guilty over the way the relationship had ended. The day before that, this 9-year-old girl in Baltimore County, about a mile from where Kirk lived, was playing in a park and disappeared, and there was a manhunt, and she was found 4 or 5 hours later, and she had been brutally murdered, sexually abused, murdered. It was just a horrible crime. And the entire community was, aghast and frightened, and Baltimore County Police went all out to try to find out who it was. There were two young boys, 7 and 10 at the time, who saw a stranger by the pond nearby where the little girl had been playing, and they became like key witnesses. And they did composite drawings with these boys. They were using a lot of what they thought were new techniques. They did a psychological profile of who they thought the killer was. For a lot of reasons, a lot of these things that they did led them eventually, it took about a month to Kirk Bloodsworth. They learned his wife filed a missing persons report when he left town. They learned he had left his job abruptly. The psychological profile said that this person probably was in a relationship with an older dominating woman, that he probably would have left town and felt a lot of guilt. There were a lot of these kinds of things. Fairly quickly after that, they believed that they had the killer, and they arrested Kirk. You had two homicide detectives who had 40 or 45 years experience between them as being police officers, right? And they were absolutely positive and convinced that they had the right person. Put yourself in the shoes of these detectives, and you have this crime, and went through all of the different leads that they had, and how they tried to determine who did this, and how they became so convinced that this person, who it turned out had nothing to do with the crime, was guilty, and how they believed he deserved to die in the gas chamber in Maryland. And the prosecutors did, and the judge did, and the jury did. And the courtroom erupted when the verdict was handed down, and people were screaming in the courtroom, "Give him the gas, give him the gas." He had an appeal, and the Court of Appeals granted him a new trial first time around, because the prosecutors had failed to turn over what's called Brady information, or possibly exonerating information, which turned out to really have nothing to do with the actual killer. Second time around, his family mortgaged their house, came up with $25,000, hired a private attorney, and different judge, and entirely different strategy, and he's convicted a second time. But the second judge was not as positive, and sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. Typically, there's a certain amount of time after the appeals are over, the evidence in the evidence room is destroyed in Baltimore County, and the second judge had this thing that he just was uncomfortable still, and kept the little girl's clothing in his chambers in his closet, so that after all the appeals were exhausted, so the second trial, all the appeals were exhausted, and Kirk was done. He had 2 trials, he'd been through the appellate process twice, and unless he found something new, some miracle, he was never going to get out of prison. But he never gave up. He wrote thousands of letters to people. All of them were signed "An Innocent Man," AIM, and eventually one of them got to somebody who called Bob Moran. He's one of those guys who went down into the deep South in the early '80s and realized that there was a catastrophe of injustice going on, and that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people on death row, had been incarcerated, had been sentenced to death, who didn't have lawyers, who had drunk lawyers, who had lawyers who didn't show up at their trials, didn't have lawyers on appeals, and he was down there doing this triage work with a couple other people. Eventually came back to Maryland to head up the Maryland Public Defender Death Penalty Unit when more and more people were being put on death row in Maryland, and he was in Maryland when people asked him to go visit Kirk. And he said, you know, I don't have time to visit somebody who's not on death row and awaiting execution. But as a favor, I'll go see him and spend 20 minutes with him, because someone who he knew well. And he went in to see Kirk, and in 20 minutes, Kirk convinced him that he was innocent and that he had to figure out some way to get him out. And that was right around the time that DNA fingerprinting was first being used. But they didn't know, they didn't have any DNA to test. The FBI had come back at the trials and said there was no blood samples, there was no semen samples that were testable, this and that, and Moran eventually uncovers the clothing that the judge had secreted, and spends $10,000 of his own money to get it, because it was expensive, really expensive back then to test it, because it was brand new. Wow. And gets it tested, and it turns out to be, and it was a long process of convincing the state's attorney's office to give up the evidence, and then to allow it to be tested, and then to, once the results came back, they wanted to do their own tests, and the question was there enough to test it twice? And there was all kinds of dramatic issues in the case, but it turned out to be not Kirk, and it was semen, and it was not Kirk, right? Clearly not Kirk Bloodsworth, and all the witnesses said it was one person, and so eventually he was released from prison, and the state's attorney's office in Baltimore County, Sandra A. O'Connor, I believe was the name of the state's attorney then, issued like a long statement detailing all the evidence against him, and at the end saying, however, this DNA cast doubt on the integrity of the conviction, so we must release him. And so Kirk goes home to Cambridge, and he's free, but people have no idea what DNA is. They think it's a technicality, and people are leaving notes on his windshield saying, you know, child killer. Not to mention the ordeal that he had to go through in prison for 9 years, having been convicted of killing a 9-year-old little girl. And Kirk decides that he's going to figure out who did it, that's the only way for him to ever really be free. And then he goes on a multi-year campaign trying to convince them to put the DNA into this growing data bank that's being developed around the country, and it took years, and Kirk had to get Bob Moran, to get Barry Scheck from the Innocence Projects in Chicago and other people to put pressure on the state's attorney's office. And I was in the middle of the research of this book, still with this, you know, knowing that the prosecutors in Baltimore, you know, were, and I got this call from Kirk, and the county attorney, the woman who had been on the prosecution team twice prosecuting him, and he says looked at him like he was a a beast, an animal, the entire time, called him up and said, we want to meet with you in Cambridge. And Kirk was like, I don't know about this, and actually chose a place where he could have his boat out in the back in case he had to run out the back. I mean, he wasn't thinking really straight probably, but they came and they said, we've put the DNA in the database and we have an absolute match of the person who did this, and it turned out to be somebody who was in the same prison tier as Kirk for 9 years and lifted weights in the same weight room. So, but trying to write it in the sense of, so that the reader can actually see how this can happen and how easily it can happen. Now we know how often it has happened. There have been 1,453 people who've been exonerated who've been on death row.